All right, to wrap up talking about group processes before we move on to stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination next week, I left you last time with a question. Do groups ever interact positively? And thankfully, the answer is yes. And we've had a little bit of an indication as to how, but I want to delve a little bit deeper into that to kind of wrap up this without just talking about the negative aspects of uh, intergroup processes. So the major thing that seems to help with um, making relations between groups better is intergroup contact. We're going to talk about that in a few different ways, but as we've already seen, it's not necessarily the case that any type of intergroup contact helps. Like, for example, just bringing two groups together sometimes can lead them to have negative outcomes, maybe because they just identify with their own groups and they want to have that positive distinctiveness between them. So although there's something intuitive to intergroup contact, it seems to be richer than this. And even the way that we talk about it colloquially, when people from different groups can't get along, and maybe from the outside we can't understand why, or can't understand why somebody from a different group doesn't like us, we might say things like, if they only knew each other, things would be better. And some of these ideas kind of get to the ways that intergroup contact actually does work. And if we want to think about intergroup contact in a more formalized way, we kind of have to go back to a book that our old friend Gordon Allport, who we've seen in the very intro of this class and talked about in terms of attitudes and how important they are. Allport wrote a book in the 50s called The Nature of Prejudice, where he laid out a lot of really important things that have driven how social psychologists have approached the study of prejudice and intergroup relations for, almost 75 years at this point. So math right on that? Not quite. Almost 70 years. Yeah, there we go. Um, so, uh, distracted myself by my own math issues. I'm not editing this out because I don't know why. Anyway, now I should. This is going on too long. Gordon Allport was important, and he wrote lots of things about prejudice in the 50s. One of the most important things he wrote in that book, though, is that not all intergroup contact, as we kind of know at this point, was created equal. He laid out specific conditions that you needed in order to have uh, good outcomes from intergroup contact. Sometimes just casual contact can actually be bad, as we've kind of seen. And contact that doesn't really, lead you to get to know somebody or cooperate with them can just activate stereotypes. So, as we've seen with our, behavioral and perceptual confirmation, those self-fulfilling prophecies we've talked about several times in this class, just interacting with somebody might lead you to think that you already know about them and believe that the things that you're perceiving confirm your stereotypes, and the behaviors that you might engage in because of those things might further elicit confirmatory behaviors. If you're not putting in any sort of work or effort and the conditions aren't helping you, just seeing or interacting with somebody from a different group can actually lead to worse outcomes and more belief in your perhaps negative expectations about somebody. So we need real meaningful, specifically structured contact to actually make conditions between different groups better. The four conditions that Allport set out in that book, The Nature of Prejudice, for effective positive intergroup contact are as follows. Um, as we kind of already know, in part, the first two from talking about realistic group conflict theory, the groups need to have kind of the same goals. They need to be working toward the same thing. They both need to benefit from what they're working toward. They both, that's where the mutual value comes out. It's not one-sided. It's not that both groups are working towards the betterment of one of them. It's that they're both getting something real and tangible and desirable out of their efforts. Another one that we've kind of already gotten to with realistic group conflict theory that the groups are actually working together. They're not, slacking and working off or getting something off of the other group's effort. They're not working in parallel. They're not working separately. They're actually cooperating. They're doing something constructive together. They're seeing the effort from each other. They are benefiting from assistance from each other. They're getting FaceTime with each other in a positive sort of setting, or a positive set of circumstances. The two that we haven't really talked about yet are equal status and support from authority. Equal status has to do with just making sure that differences in resources or prestige are minimized. So when there is a hierarchy, like let's say between high status and low status people, rich people and poor people, groups that have resources and groups that don't, any type of hierarchy just reinforces differences, and awareness of those hierarchies just show you how things are not equitable. But if you can put groups on equal footing, have them have the same status, the same sort of prestige, then that will highlight instead similarities and improve attitudes between those groups. Finally, support from authority is just that there is some sort of higher power, so to speak, that is endorsing the positive cooperation between these groups, whether it's some sort of governmental entity, maybe it's a boss or an instructor. It is somebody with a higher level of status that is endorsing that these two groups, or more than two groups, should be working together, and that this is a desirable, good, positive thing. So Allport suggested, and much research shows, that if you have all of these things, then contact between groups is going to be a good thing that leads to less hostility, less tension, more positive attitudes, more equity, and things like that. One really famous instance of this is something that one of your textbook authors actually participated in. Elliot Aronson participated in something that is kind of famous now that he developed with some colleagues and grad students called the Jigsaw Classroom. So the superintendent of the school system in Austin, Texas, in the, I believe it was the late 60s or early 70s, he had been a student of Aronson's, and he remembered different things he had learned in college, learning about psychology from Aronson, and remembered talking about his work on prejudice and how it had been inspired by some of these things from Gordon Allport. So he contacted his old instructor and asked him to, could you develop something to help us in this desegregated school system where black and brown students are performing very poorly, and there's a lot of conflict between students of different race and ethnic backgrounds. So they wanted to improve performance, they wanted to reduce, bad behavior and fights, and they wanted to make sure that, everyone was actually getting an education. So they brought in Aronson and some of his colleagues. And what they found that by structuring a classroom in a very specific way that met all those different conditions from Allport's, ideal conditions for group contact, the students actually started getting along, not just like tolerating one another, but actually, having cross-group friendships, working together in order to, further their educational goals, right? Even like little kids, realizing the value in working together and, being good to each other. So the way that it, had been initially was that, white students that had more resources in this area were, fighting for attention. The students of color who were not as prepared for school and, didn't necessarily know the answers to things, they were either they really didn't know, or they felt like they didn't know, or they said doubt, and they wouldn't raise their hands as much as the white kids, and it just it was not a good learning environment for a lot of the children. So I'm not going to play this clip right here. It's in the slides that I've posted. I'd encourage you to watch it. It's Aronson talking about, the experience of putting this forth in the Austin school district and explaining exactly what they did. But just to tell you how the Jigsaw Classroom works and how it meets these conditions really quickly here, it's basically just the idea that you've probably done Jigsaw Classroom activities and just not maybe necessarily known what it's called if you haven't heard of it before. But it is where you have groups that are divided up in class, like usually randomly divided up, you count off or something. And then each of those groups has a set of information or a new skill or something that they become an expert in, and they work together to learn about that skill. Then you shuffle up all the groups so that you have new groups that have formed that all have people from those different initial groups. So they come together and they teach each other that information, or they teach each other that skill. And generally it's set up in a way that they can't succeed without taking the information from everybody else. And this tends to be a really effective learning and teaching tool to let kids, and even in business settings in college, take an active role in learning and teaching each other, things like that. And it's rooted in this prejudice reduction sort of model that Aronson came up using Allport's conditions. So the way that this meets these conditions is, everyone has a common goal. Everyone wants to do well, or to, feel good or succeed, or please the teacher or their parents. They all have these kind of common things that they're trying to reach. They're cooperating in that they have to work together. They can't do it alone. They only have one piece of the puzzle, so to speak, one piece of information or one skill. So they have to listen to each other. They have to help each other in order to get all the information or learn all the skills to complete whatever task they're working on. The equal status part comes in because these groups don't have leaders. There's no inequities in information. They're all on equal footing because each one of them has something necessary, and each one of them is the only person that knows that necessary thing. So there's no disparities here in who is important in the groups. They're all acting as a teacher and they're all acting as a student. And maybe one that's very obvious here, support from authority. The teacher, in most settings, a pretty visible ultimate authority figure, is giving this their endorsement that this is how we're going to do the class. This is a good way to do it. This is worthwhile. And giving people the structure under which to do it. So Aronson very carefully used Allport's conditions to design this, and again, it not only ends up being a really good way to reduce prejudice and aggression and tension and hostility between groups, but it actually, in general, is just a very useful learning tool. So after just about 2 months in the Jigsaw Classroom, there was greater respect between the groups. The minority students who were, having the most negative outcomes, they built self-esteem. They started coming to school more often, especially, Latinx students in this district were just not coming to school because it was such deflating and poor experience for them. But they started to come to school much more frequently, and students all learned more and performed better. And so these increases in learning and performance were across the board. White kids, Latinx kids, black kids, everybody started doing better. They didn't really see, there was a uniform effect across all the different racial groups and ethnic groups. So everybody benefits from this. And really, 8 weeks for an intervention like this it kind of sounds like a long time, but it's really not in the scope of what people generally do to try to, change things in a school district. This really changed the culture in Austin by all accounts at this time, and made things a whole lot better in the schools where they implemented it. So this is a really famous success story of how you can apply the lessons from social psychology to actually make real change out in the world for people. Obviously, that's just one study. It's been replicated many times. But if you really want to know how something works and if an effect is real, it's really important to review lots and lots of different research. So one really important thing that we unfortunately don't have as much time as I would like to talk about in this class is how something I've said before, but maybe not enough, is that single studies don't necessarily tell us anything. That we need to find things over and over in order to know that they're true and to really estimate the size of effects and relationships that we see among our important variables of interest. In order to estimate the size of these effects, researchers often do something called a meta-analysis. So analyzing the effects of something across different studies. And this allows us to, again, estimate an average type of effect size rather than just relying on a single study, which can be flawed or mistaken or subject to questionable research practices. If you look at everything at once, published and unpublished, then you can have a good idea of what a real effect is like. So Thomas Pettigrew and Linda Trop, two researchers that contributed enormously to prejudice research over the years, not just with this big meta-analysis, but with their own original work. They contacted researchers that they knew did prejudice reduction stuff and asked them for their published papers and their unpublished papers, because there's a bias towards confirmatory evidence in published papers. So when you do a meta-analysis, you want to ask people for unpublished data too, because that's the data that's most likely to not show effects. So you want to get both. But they had 515 published and unpublished studies that yielded over 700 samples of people and over 250,000 participants. So rather than like 100 or 250 participants or something, they had 250,000 participants that they're averaging across here. And what they wanted to see was, does contact improve intergroup perceptions and relations? And they found that an enormous proportion of these studies, 94% of them, showed that prejudice and stereotypes decreased or got better with contact. When you do a meta-analysis, you get these effect sizes that are usually presented kind of converted into something like a correlation. So the average effect size was negative 0.21, meaning that if you add contact compared to no contact, that prejudice and stereotypes are reduced. That's the negative number by 0.21. So this is a small to moderate effect size, but very consistent across these different studies. And maybe most importantly, reaching back to Allport's conditions, this is just contact versus no contact. If you only include the studies that met Allport's ideal conditions, then you saw a pretty big increase in that effect size, that it increases by over 50%, from about 0.2 to over 0.3. So if you only meet those conditions, then that effect size gets even bigger, indicating that Allport and his intellectual descendants were onto something there. And this is a meta-analysis that has been informing us. It's a little old now, it's 2006, but people have updated it since then. This still does seem to hold very important finding for social psychology. One really important thing about it too is that, or about contact in general, I guess, is that you can't always bring people in contact with one another. So sometimes it's dangerous if the groups are really hostile towards each other. You can't just bring them together right away necessarily, or sometimes it's too logistically complicated or expensive or time consuming, or sometimes your starting point might not be always to bring people into the same room. So sometimes people have tried to do something a little bit easier where you just have people imagine contact with another group. And we find that imagining positive contact with other groups also tends to have positive effects. Oops. So Rhiannon Crisp and Miles Turner, some researchers that do work on this, did a meta-analysis of just imagining contact that has all four conditions. So if you imagine these positive types of intergroup contact, that improves both implicit, so like IAT type things, and explicit measures of attitudes towards outgroups. So won't go into the weeds on all the statistics for this one or anything. There is not as much imagined contact research as there is for real contact research. So I think this meta-analysis they did, a little over 5 years ago, I think there were only 70 some studies in this compared to the hundreds in the other one, but still a consistent positive effect showing that just imagining outgroup contact with these positive conditions is good. So it might be a good starting point for lots of different types of intergroup conflict situations where it might not be safe or possible always to bring different groups together. And it's cheap, you just give people instructions and tell them what to think about, and it can have lasting, real effects on how they feel about people from other groups. So why does contact work? There are entire classes on why contact works, actually. So we don't have tons of time to talk about all these different processes. It might be that it breaks down our rigid ideas about how groups work, decategorization. It might be that it lets us feel good about our own groups while maintaining, the positive things about other groups. It might be that it just makes us feel a little less anxious. Anxiety seems to be a very important driver in intergroup attitudes and prejudice, so it might reduce anxiety. It might have something to do with friendships. Friendships, you'll notice probably in a lot of the interactions you have with friends, they meet those different criteria for positive contacts, and have one really special one too of self-disclosures, that you're sharing things with other people, making them kind of individuate you and see you as a person rather than a member of a category. All these things are probably contributing in some way to why contact works. I'm going to talk really briefly, though, just a little bit more about one called recategorization, which is kind of what it sounds like, that rather than just focusing on two distinct groups, you might come to think of them as, cooperating and being one group. And again, we'll talk about some of these other types of things when we get to prejudice next week. But one that has to do with, recategorization is the common in-group identity model, something that Sam Gartner and Jack Dovidio came up with in the late 90s and early 2000s. That again, when we think about intergroup conflict, we think about in-groups and out-groups, or our own in-groups and other groups, our out-groups, being in conflict with one another. What if we didn't think about them as in-group and out-groups? What if we thought about one superordinate common identity that we share, rather than thinking about those distinctions? So instead of dividing the world into us and them, well, why don't we just think about all of us as us, rather than dividing it into us and them? So they think, and have shown with lots of interesting evidence, that if you add context to these in-group and out-group relations with the positive proper conditions, then you, instead of thinking about in-group and out-group, think about a bigger inclusive in-group that includes that out-group. So, you have your group, you have another group to which you do not belong, but after having positive contact, you might instead think about it as our group. another superordinate in-group that encompasses both. And just a couple examples to kind of drive this home. In movies where there's like an alien invasion or something like that, you might see factions in a particular country or something that are, making waves, and there's conflict going on. But then as soon as there's a threat from outside, there's an alien invasion or something, groups come together and they work together and they think about themselves as members of a particular nation. Or in like Independence Day or lots of movies with alien invasions, I know a really timely 1996 movie reference, but in that movie there is a big emphasis on thinking about people as like citizens of the world rather than citizens of different nations. So they recast the Independence Day, July 4th, where very conveniently the big fight against the aliens is happening, as the world's Independence Day rather than just the American Independence Day. Another way it kind of happens is, with different athletic conferences, like in college sports, for example. You have a conference like the Big Ten that has 14 teams in it, and during your conference season, where you're playing all these teams, your in-group, out-group boundaries are really salient. Where if you are an Iowa Hawkeye fan, you might really hate the Minnesota Golden Gophers. You can't stand those other teams that are your rivals during the regular season. But then when you get into the postseason, where you're playing in a bowl or in a championship game, you oftentimes like to see teams from your conference do well, because you are going up against the other conferences, and you want to show that your conference, the Big Ten in this case, is better than the other ones. So you think of this superordinate group subsuming all these other in-groups, and you kind of see a kinship with these other groups that you didn't necessarily like before. Maybe a more serious and I think impactful effect here, kind of what we talked about with pro-social behavior a little bit back a while ago, that after 9/11, for example, you saw lots of unity within the American government. People didn't really talk about different partisan problems for a while, and that had its own relatively negative outcomes later on eventually, but for a little while after 9/11, people really in the United States had a strong emphasis on being American, or being part of the same team, rather than being Democrats versus Republicans and things like that. So you'll notice something in common here, that they all have to do with kind of bringing groups together against some other group or some other threat. So it is not a perfect way of kind of bringing groups together, because there needs to be some other outside threat, sometimes another group, but oftentimes it can be something else, like for example, climate change might be something that in an ideal world could unite different groups together in order to combat this bigger existential threat, and bring different countries together to cooperate to stop an ongoing problem. That works to varying degrees at varying times, but it is kind of following these different ideas about common in-group identity. All right, that wraps up this unit, so I will be back with you next week to talk about stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination.